Awesome. So, thanks for coming on the podcast. I'm excited to talk to you.
Totally. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
So, I've had a snowboarder and a skier on before, but that is the extent of the winter sports representation that my podcast has covered. So, I would like to go into that as well because I do think that winter sports are geared a little bit more toward the extreme sports spectrum as opposed to summer sports. And so I would like to talk about the mental side of extreme sports a little bit more. Is that good for you?
Yeah,
Or do you
totally.
want to talk more about snowboarding in itself?
No, I'm good.
Okay, awesome.
Whatever you want to chat about is all good with me.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
So let's talk about how you got into snowboarding in the first place. I mean, was this always just something that you looked at and said, "This is what I want to do with the rest of my life," or was it from the beginning something that you just saw as a way to get energy out, or something to do on the weekends?
Um, Honestly, it was kind of all of those things, but also none of those things. Kind of like everybody falls into whatever they fall into in their youth. And for me, I grew up in the first suburb outside of Minneapolis, Minnesota, called St. Louis Park. And at the time, the early 80s, the counterculture kind of sports stuff was really taking hold in our kind of geographic location. I had um, I had a neighbor who I was more or less obsessed with as a young child. When I was like 5, 6 years old, he was a guy who was in high school at the time. He was a punk guy and liked skateboarding and snowboarding and all that sort of stuff. So I really kind of like looked up to him big time and became really obsessed with skateboarding initially. And then from skateboarding at 6 years old, I started to find snowboarding. I think my parents got me a Trans World Snowboarding magazine, and when I was 6 or 7 years old, so that was probably in like 85, 86 or something like that, and 87 maybe. And I loved the visuals from that magazine, and it was something that I really, really gravitated towards and wanted to do. And at the time, they didn't make snowboarding equipment small enough for children, so I bit the bullet for a couple of years and skied when I was 6 and 7, and then when I was 7, 8, was when Moro snowboards started making stuff for kids, and that's how I got into it.
So, was it ever something that your parents pushed you into, or did you kind of get the ball rolling by yourself?
Yeah, no, not at all. It was, my parents were wildly supportive of me for. Sorry, I'll just turn off my notifications here. Um, Basically, my parents never pushed me into anything. They were always super supportive, no matter what it was that I wanted to do. I mean, I was a kid who played all sports all the time, and that was pretty much 100% of my focus inadvertently for the time that I knew what sports were till I graduated high school. So I mean, I grew up playing hockey, basketball, football, skateboarding, snowboarding, you name it, and I did it. But my parents were never the ones to kind of push and say like, hey, you should really focus on this, or you should focus more time here, or anything like that. It was just kind of a, whatever you want to do, we're here to support. If you want to join a club program with coaching, like, that's totally fine. It's up to you. Here's this and this, and they put it in front of me, and away I went.
So, did you ever think that you were drawn more toward individual sports as opposed to team sports? Because what you just laid out were the majority of them were individual sports.
Yeah, it again, it really wasn't a product of me focusing and honing in, thinking that I would become a professional one day by any means. It was always just what I liked doing. And like I said, again, I played plenty of team sports. Soccer was another team sport that I played growing up from elementary school all the way into high school. And so it wasn't a sense that like I preferred individual sports more to team sports or anything like that. It was just that snowboarding was one that, um, you know, for me, I quickly saw the results in my own ability level from the time that I was, I don't know, 10, 11, to where, um, you know, the, the jumps in progression for me from, we'll say, like 13 to 17 were pretty drastic and noticeable. And I grew up with US ASA, which is the US Snowboard Association, for amateur sports back in the day. Now they've since brought on skiing, but it was a snowboard only competition series that was throughout the nation. And, from a young age, I kind of always seemed to hit the podium and always kind of did well in events and stuff like that. So it just kind of was the thing that propelled me to continue.
So when US Snowboard got wind of you and wanted you to go pro, what was that process like? I mean, was it
So
was it were you expecting that kind of notoriety to happen so early, or was it something that you were unprepared for and you just kind of stumbled into?
yeah, like I said, I mean, it was really kind of a all the stars aligned, and in snowboarding, it really isn't that way. It's not at all like traditional sports where, an organization like US Snowboarding has you go pro or anything like that. I mean, I was essentially competing at a professional level when I was 17 years old in Grand Prix events, which is the USSA sanctioned event series in the United States. There was another series back then called the AST, the American Snowboard Tour, and was doing World Cups internationally by the time I was 17 and 18 years old. Um, but it wasn't the sense that US Snowboarding asked me to be a part of the organization as a pro member of their team, but more so that in the individual sports, the individual sponsors are the ones that kind of dictate who goes pro or not, or when you go pro or anything like that. So at the time, I was with a company called Ice Age Snowboards throughout high school. They no longer exist or anything like that. But it was a company that was, in the late 90s or I guess it would be like the 90s, the entire decade. They tried to make their way as a, snowboard company and had a bunch of pros on the team, and I was an amateur with a very small, travel budget salary or whatever. So that's kind of what classified me as professional, was that I was getting paid by a company to do what I was doing at a, you know, young age. Then uh, in the year, I think it was 2001, um, I was living in Portland, Oregon, going to school at Portland State University, and I then was approached by Head Skis and Snowboards to ride for them, and started a relationship there that lasted, I think, 5 or 6 years. And that's when I was asked by a US Snowboard team to join their A team program, and was fully funded by USSA at that point. So that was when it was kind of like fully game on. I guess I'm going to take a couple of years off of college and see where I can take this. And and I never really went back, and the rest is kind of history.
So how does a young snowboarder get the attention of these brands in the first place? I mean, how much of it is you reaching out and how much of it is the brands seeking you?
hmm so funny enough, I would say it's about 80 to 90% the brands seeking out talent. For me, when I was younger, I was always a super shy person, so I never really had a lot of networking skills as a teenager to really understand or know how to approach brands in a way that was like a hey, sponsor me kind of thing. But as I said, I'd been on the contest circuit since I was single digits old, um, and then grew up with the whole progression of it all, and started competing internationally and professionally at 16, 17 years old. And I remember pretty vividly, it was one of those events that the marketing manager, team manager of Smith Optics, approached me and gave me his card after my run. I think I got like 10th or ninth or something like that when I was 16, here in Breckenridge, Colorado, actually. And he said, "Hey man, I've been watching you for a long time. Give me a call. We'd love to help you, work something out." And I was like, "Okay." I don't even know what to do. So I waited, a handful of days after the event, and I sent the guy an email. And before you know it, it was kind of again, on a amateur kind of sponsorship thing with Smith Optics. I had my board sponsor, and then US snowboard team in the background as well. And then, once things kind of evolve with a couple of companies, especially brands that are very popular like Smith Optics and um, Head Snowboards wasn't overly popular with snowboarding at the time, but they were making a big push, and so other companies noticed, and it just kind of snowballed from there. And then I eventually hired or started working with a sports agent who helped me to kind of navigate the management of all that stuff.
So when you were 15, 16, 17, 18,
Hmm.
navigating this brand environment, I mean, I think it's kind of similar to what's happening with the NIL right now, but you were
Hmm.
doing it 20 years prior to this legislation. So
Yes.
do you see kind of the same conversations happening with the other sports that you were having when you were kind of working that stuff out by yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. But I will say, I think the kids are far more savvy than we were back, in the early '90s of trying to figure this kind of stuff out. And again, with snowboarding being, a new and non-established sport like that, there was a lot of influx of corporate dollars going in, but nobody really knew how to harness it. Where I think a lot of the kids these days in the big sports at least have a little bit more of an understanding of kind of how it works. I think just how their sports are organized and all of that. And I think the NIL stuff is awesome. That's something that I've always felt was really hurting kind of the college and even high school sports atmosphere, because those kids are extremely talented, and they have a very small window to make and earn the amount that they'll earn in their careers. And I'm just glad to see that it's kind of moving in that direction.
So let's talk about your career. I mean,
Hmm.
you were 10 years with US Snowboarding, yes?
Yeah, I think 11 actually. I think yeah, it was like 2000 to 2011 was my tenure. But yeah, it was a nice decade of professional snowboarding, traveling the world, and going and doing contests and photo shoots and all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
So how did that feel to have this national team believe
Hmm.
in you for a decade? Because we were just talking about, I mean, a lot of these collegiate athletes are only
Hmm.
getting half a decade of time professionally before their
Yeah.
career is over. I mean, an 11-year career in any kind of sport, especially an extreme sport like snowboarding, is really impressive.
Yeah, thanks. It's funny because I never always, I never think about it like too deep, just because it was a period in my youth where, 18, 19 years old, and you're kind of whisked into this professional sports atmosphere, and you're just a kid, and, learning how to be a young adult and make your way through international waters in the world and all that kind of stuff. So it's nothing that I've really dwelled on too much from the mental side of things. But it is crazy, just because, especially now, you look at the sport and you look at a lot of the athletes who, um, have kind of been in it for the same amount of time that I was, but are not necessarily struggling, but are having a more difficult time with the longevity of it. I feel like it's a much shorter shelf life. I feel like kids are in it at 18, 19 years old, and then they're kind of done at like 25 or 26 or whatever it is. And again, it's just really cool to see some of the kids that when I was kind of at the end of my career, people like Taylor Gold, Scotty James, and um, you know, um, God, there's so many riders right now that are kind of on that contest circuit that are like grinding, 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 and they're just not seeing the benefits that we saw during my generation. So it's a very different environment, and it's interesting to kind of follow, even though I don't follow it nearly as closely as I used to.
So what do you think is the biggest difference in the longevity of these athletes now than when you were riding?
Um, you
Because the
know,
sport hasn't really changed. I mean,
right.
the rules haven't changed. So
Yeah.
what do you think is the key to that difference?
Honestly, I think it's corporate and sponsor support. I think that the dollar volume that has kind of moved away from supporting snowboarding as a sport really has shifted pretty drastically. Like I said, when in the 90s and most of the thousands up to 2010, there was a huge influx of dollars from all kinds of companies, all kinds of corporate sponsorships. I mean, you look at Shaun White won the Olympics in 2006, and he got a Hewlett Packard deal. He got a deal with Target and all those kinds of things. And really, he was the only one who had the sponsorship level on that level of like true big timer professional athlete, kind of Serena Williams, Roger Federer, LeBron James type of sponsorship level. Nobody else was afforded any of that stuff. So you had him all the way up here, and then you had everybody else kind of scraping by. And I use that very loosely because it was lucrative for a handful of athletes for a long time, but just in a very different way. And I think that is the hard part with individual sports, is that people don't know how to kind of harness it or market it and turn it into, for lack of a better analogy, something like a NASCAR that you can follow and track. And, you have your favorite athletes or drivers, what have you. And, it's something that's constantly in the media. Snowboarding, for the longest time, they tried to put it on TV for a long time, but then it disappears in the summer. And then people forget about it. Same with like World Cup skiing. People follow Lindsey Vonn and Michaela Schifrin, but they don't know any of the other athletes. So it's a really steep cutoff as far as the sport goes with support.
So, what do you think would happen to the sport if we say covered it in the summer while these athletes were still on the circuits? They were just
Yeah,
in higher altitudes that snowed constantly.
right,
I
right.
mean,
And
you're
we're
essentially like chasing snow around the world, but you
right.
don't see the coverage in the summer. I mean, you're
Hmm.
still competing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So like our contest schedule back years ago, when I was riding, we would basically start the year down in the southern hemisphere, obviously during our kind of summer months, and there was usually a contest in Chile, and then New Zealand would kind of be back to back. There would be a couple of World Cups down there in the summertime, and then early fall we would head out to Switzerland typically for the high glacier stuff there for early season World Cups. And so there really is kind of a constant circuit that just doesn't get the traction or the television, the media time that say the NBA gets. Like covers summer league, covers the whole season of NBA, and then it covers the Olympics and basketball stuff. So like there's just constant bombardment of these athletes and the sport, to where people who participate in snowboarding love it, but I don't think that they necessarily always are in tune freestyle wise. Like getting on a mountain and the freestyle aspect of snowboarding are two very different things. And um, pure enjoyment getting out on a mountain and riding powder and riding mountain stuff is a totally different feeling than half pipe doing double corks or 1080s, back to back 1080s, whatever it is. So it's hard to translate. And I think that only in recent history they started covering on TV much better, with Todd Richards as an analyst explaining how difficult these things are to people who don't understand. I just think it's an access thing.
So, what drew you to the events that you rode?
Yeah, so like I said, when I was like 6 7 years old, I was pretty obsessed with skateboarding, and I just happened to find half pipe skateboarding the most liberating, freeing feeling out of skateboarding. Transition riding is something that's really hard to describe. It's a constant kind of like feeling of weightlessness, and the gravity transition is really hard to describe to people who haven't done it and don't understand it. But then that obviously progressed and progressed, and once you start getting amplitude and air out of the half pipe, it's literally flying, which is completely insane. And um, So if you can imagine just like short travel bungee jumping, that's kind of like that, where like, you're riding up the wall and then you air out and then you land back in and you're gaining speed and it's one of those things that's really hard to describe.
So, what is going through your mind when you're getting those few seconds of air every time you go up? I mean, I was watching some of your X Games highlights and
Hmm.
they're legit.
Yeah.
Like, I
Yeah.
can't imagine what's going through your head while you're performing. I mean, there's a certain time you have to grab your board and there's a certain rotation speed. I mean, what all goes into those few seconds of airtime?
Yeah, and everybody's different with that. I was somebody who really kind of let my body and muscle memory and just kind of feel of it all take over for me. I wasn't, the type of person who was an engineer, kind of, studying physics to try and figure out what would be best or anything like that. And I don't know if anybody particularly was, but for me, it was just how much faster can I go? How much more amplitude can I get? And you want the tricks to look good. You want to grab longer. You want to, not be squirrely in the air. So like, it was a lot of trampoline training. It was a lot of trial and error in the half pipe at a young age. When I first started, half pipes were like 12 feet tall, basically. So as a kid, that's big. But then they progressively grew and grew as I grew. And I would say the majority of my career, they were probably around the 18-foot mark. And that's where I kind of found the most success for me, just because that was what felt completely at ease. It felt like home for me. I felt like I could go as big and as fast as I want, and um, nothing would happen. And then the 22s came along, and that was a total game changer, and double the speed, double the amplitude, and it was hard to get used to because it all happened so quick. It was just like all of a sudden, oh, 18's done, 22's in. Um, and learning to adapt to that was a difficult process, but something that we all did. And yeah.
So, what is the mentality of someone who just repeatedly skis up walls?
Again, it's hard because I grew up doing it. I grew up loving the feeling of it. And, people ask me all the time, is like, oh, you God, you must have been crazy to do all that stuff, because it's hard to wrap your head around. But when you grow up doing it and it's just kind of second nature, it becomes like pitching a baseball. It becomes like, uh, you know, getting into a dunk contest in basketball or playing football, whatever it is. It's just kind of my symbiosis in sport. And, um, now look at it as a near 40-year-old person, and I definitely am not doing the things that I used to. I still go out and I snowboard all the time, but I'm usually only in a half pipe maybe once or twice a year, if that anymore. And I'm not, doing 20-foot airs by any means, but it's still very fun and something for me to do.
So, let's also talk about the sports psychology that
Hmm.
goes into weightlessness.
Yeah.
Can you talk about your experience with the mental side of snowboarding and what role that played in every outing that you had?
Yeah. For me, most of it was centered around the fun and the overall feeling you get from doing what we do. And that was pure happiness. Um, you throw in all the external stuff, and that's where things start to get a little weird with pleasing your sponsors, having, putting a self pressure on to perform every event, every week, all the time of the year, having to go out and be the cool guy out at the bar or whatever it is. So, like, there's all these external things that are, kind of pushing down on you. But then the best times that I always had were always kind of the static, um, ambient kind of just mentality where everything more or less either went white or black or whatever you want to call it. And you're just doing what you love. And that's where things seemed to work out the best for me, was not having any of the external cares around me, and being able to just be in the moment. And now meditation, but back, you know 15 plus years ago, it was just like trying to figure out how to calm yourself, and um, be up at the start gate and have the TVs on you and all that kind of stuff, and being able to kind of weed out the BS. And that took a very long time to kind of figure out. And when I was young, I will never forget the first finals that I made at the professional level, which coincidentally was where the Smith guy gave me his card. And I went to drop in for my first finals run, and I fell dropping in because I was so nervous, so excited, and like, just wanted to do well. And some of the guys who were older than me at the time and perennial podium finishers and guys that I looked up to, like Rob Kingwell, Seth Westcott was one of them. Ricky Bauer was another one who ended up being a coach of mine for years. And, they all kind of knew that I was a lone wolf at the top of the half pipe, and, knew everybody, but wasn't like associated with a team yet or anything like that. And really just kind of were like, hey, you did the hard work. You made it to the finals, man. Like, chill out, relax, and just do whatever you got to do to have fun. Cause yeah, like, and they really like, that was the probably biggest help and advice I've ever gotten in my career.
So did you ever have any sports psychology influence? Like did US Snowboard have any kind of psychological assistance?
So they did, um, but it wasn't very full time. And I think it was more gear at the time, not to start the rivalry again, but at the time, the skiers had the majority of the funding. Snowboarding was coming up and was more popular or gaining in popularity, but we didn't have access to all the things that the downhillers like Bodie Miller, Lindsey Vonn, and Tommy Moe, and all those legendary skiers kind of had access to. We only had access to it from time to time. Um, there was a awesome sports psychologist who we did have access to in and around the Olympics kind of only, but it wasn't at least not that I knew of. I didn't know if I could ever just, call and talk to him and be like, hey, I'm really messed up this week. I don't know what to do. Or, like, I didn't have that, at least to my knowledge. But now I believe, and it seems that US skiing and snowboarding has added either more of a full-time component or more mental health professionals in their um, organization, and it seems like it's becoming far more widely accepted too. Just because, funny thing that it, it's very difficult again to kind of chat about the stresses and pressures of athletes to perform, and we are our own worst enemies. And if it's not perfect for us, then we are kind of in a little mini depression for a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks until you can kind of get out of it. So it's this never ending cycle of, yes, I won. This is great. And then like the next week, oh, I can't believe I got fifth. Like, man, like I was riding really well. I don't know what happened. What the hell, and you're just like constantly over analyzing everything that you do. And it just, yeah, it's very, very difficult.
So that just wavelength coupled
Mhm.
with how young you were,
Yes.
competing at the national level.
Hmm.
I mean, that had to trigger something
Probably.
psychologically.
Yeah, probably. But at the time, like I said, being in your young 20s, you, you're still a baby, you're still learning life and life outside of high school and all that random BS. But, so me, I always grew up as a very independent person. Um, Again, my parents were wildly supportive, but I always thought that I could figure it out myself. So it was one of those things where I would, like I said, struggle for a week and try to get out of a funk, and it would occur naturally, and I'd just keep rolling. And then 2 or 3 weeks later, be another thing where like I wouldn't be able to land my finals runs for 2 events or something like that. I would end up like 10th, and I would be pissed off, bummed, upset for another 2 weeks. And then we'd be in a new location and try new things, and just do whatever you can to get out of it. But at the time, you're, like I said, young 20s, you have no idea. You have like, mental health wasn't even a thing back then outside of, psychology and psychiatry training. And there certainly wasn't any talk of mental health in sports arena very often. And yeah, it's just really interesting for me to now look back and kind of be like, wow, that was really messed up.
And especially with the amount of turnover that you had. I mean, you didn't even really have time to register
Mm-mm.
what you could have done differently because you
No.
were already on to the physically and mentally onto the next half pipe.
Hmm.
Was that an issue as well? Where you weren't
Yeah.
you weren't even really working through what you had just done before you had to move on to something different?
Yeah, totally. I remember pretty well. I think it was 2004 was like a huge breakout year for me where I went from, maybe hitting 1 or 2 podiums a year to like almost hitting them all, like every single one that entire year. And then the following year, I remember feeling really, really good and going into X Games and then just not being able to land a run and finishing dead last. And then, it kind of fell into the quicksand after that of like, oh man, like being really hard on myself and just not being able to perform really the rest of the year until the spring. I think it was US Open. I finally got like a second place at US Open at the end of the year, but then, just went and worked super hard the following year and back at it and back, kind of on the winning streak and podium streak. And, so it's very cyclical, and you can train as much as you want and you can be out there as long as you want. And it doesn't matter, I mean, it's pretty interesting how, I found a lot of times if I had less practice, I would actually do better because I was kind of like, I don't care, or whatever it is. And um, the more and more that I ground out and grind through training and try to get more runs, more laps, more hiking, more whatever, it would kind of have a reverse effect on me.
That's really interesting.
Hmm.
I mean, do you think that that was just like I mean, some people, when they're taking tests, they don't
Yeah.
even really have to study, they just have to skim the material. That sounds like what worked best for you.
Yes, in the physical aspect, yes, not so much in the educational aspect. But yeah, that was very much how, so I started. And I've tried talking to a handful of people after I kind of retired about like my training. And I would more or less, I started training as if everything were an event where I would go up, I would take like 2 or 3 runs really fast, try to land everything first time perfectly, and then I would stop for about an hour, kind of more or less simulating how an event would go, because there's typically in the morning it's from 7 a.m. to like 8:30 a.m. is pre-finals or pre-event training, and you get like 2 or 3 runs at most, and then you wait an hour until your run is up, and then you get a run, and then you wait another hour until your second run is up, and that's it. That's qualifying. Um, so that's more or less how I started to figure out training was I'm going to do 3 runs right off the bat, first thing in the morning. you know, I know this half pipe like the back of my hand, so I'm just going to do it, and would do 2 or 3 runs. Like I said, first run without any practice, um, contest level runs. And then I would sit for an hour, and then I would go back. I would do 1 run, and then I would sit for an hour, and then I go back and do 1 run, and then that was it. And then I'd be on with my day.
So
Um,
during those hour breaks, what were you thinking about? Did it have
um,
anything to do with the event, or were you just totally blocking that out, like blinders on, I'm not gonna think about this?
it was almost the blinders thing, but at the same time, it was kind of, again, it became kind of a meditative thing where I was going over my head like the routine, the runs, the tricks that I wanted to do, and think like, oh well, if this happens, I do this, And a lot of it was adaptability because things go wrong. If you do a 900 instead of a 1080, you got to quick, think very quickly as to what you're going to do next instead of your original run and adapt that way. And then, so I think about all those things a lot of the time, and then again, I would kind of almost train if the worst case scenario happened. So then the second run, I would do just something entirely different, just in case.
So this podcast ends up, a lot of the people that I've had on have
Hmm.
talked about visualization
Yeah.
and how very little goes as planned in
Hmm.
sports. And that's what continues to drive us forward,
Hmm.
because nothing is very predictable. And
Hmm.
that sounds like exactly what happened every time you snowboarded. I mean, you had no idea how you're going to land anything or
Hmm.
how many rotations you would get before you felt the snow back under you. So
Yeah.
how did you work around visualizing that experience? I mean, because when we're talking about visualization, we're not always talking about visualizing 100% of an amazing time. We're also working through everything that could possibly go wrong.
Hmm. Yeah. Like I said, it was a lot of trial and error. It was a lot of messing up. It was a lot of, just being in the half pipe all the time. And um, I remember when we first started, like I was one of the first riders who started consistently throwing a frontside 1080. And then after that happened, a lot of the guys started doing the back-to-back 1080s. So then I had to quick, learn that rather than a 1080 to a 720 or 900 or whatever it was that I was doing. And yeah, I mean, you said it. It's just, constant repetition. It's constant training and learning that adaptability of, hey, you know, whatever happens, happens. And you can either, work your way out of it, or you can fall down and stay complacent.
So what got you to the X Games?
Oh, yeah, that I mean, again, tons of support from parents and coaches, and friends and family and everything like that. But just a real hardcore drive of my own to really want to be able to make that level of event. And yeah, it's really funny. I had a friend in high school when I started kind of doing the professional level events and stuff. I think it was the summer after we graduated high school, and had learned some new tricks and was really feeling super confident about like my snowboarding as a whole. And he asked me, he was somebody who did not snowboard, doesn't know snowboarding very well or anything like that, but is a traditional sports guy, and asked me if I ever thought I would, win the X Games. And at that point, I'd never been to the X Games, so I was like, God, I don't know, man. Like, that would be a dream of mine. It would be great. I don't know. And that's kind of how I took things. I think throughout my whole career was never like, I am going to do this. I'm going to be here. Or, this is my goal, even though it was a goal of mine to put it on that pedestal because, again, I feel like it just kind of naturally was something that I was driven towards. And it always seemed to kind of not necessarily go my way, but lend itself to making it part of my reality.
So then with that mentality of if I win in X Games, that's cool. You
Yeah.
ended up winning 2 gold medals and beating Shaun White out of a
Yeah.
gold.
Yeah. Yeah. And
How
that
did
that
that
one
happen?
that one was really special. So again, as athletes, we really have a hard time of getting out of our own heads. 2006, I was riding really well into the year, but the whole Olympic thing really was a drain on my mental state because it was something that I wanted. And I think I put a lot of pressure on myself to make that team. I'd been with US Snowboarding for 4 years now, and all my sponsors and everything. And obviously, the Olympics is the biggest TV show in the world. So, um, that was something that I really wanted. I knew I was right there for. I mean, I was perennial kind of top 3, top 5 athlete for the last 3, 4 years at that point, and knew it was, kind of right there for the taking. And, it was just one of those things where I could never land a run because I was overthinking. Um, 2007 happened and the pressure came off and I had fun again and was just kind of again, kind of like 2004 was on a complete tear. Just the amplitude and my writing ability was like this much higher than everybody else's at that year, and it just kind of happened. And it was one of those things that was, um, Shaun I think had won every single event from 2005 till that moment. So that one was pretty special.
Oh my goodness. I
Yeah.
mean, it's like you were talking about earlier when I think of the first snowboarders that I was ever introduced to,
Hmm.
Shaun White is that person.
Yeah.
And to say that you everything that you had worked up to not only resulted in a gold, but it
Hmm.
also resulted in beating Shaun White.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and that's super interesting too, because like we grew up snowboarding together, even in the amateur stuff, and we've always been neck and neck. I mean, another guy, Danny Cass, was somebody who we grew up with. That he and I are the same age. JJ Thomas is another athlete. Kiera Dillon is another, wildly talented legend snowboarder who, and we all pushed each other through a period of 12 to 15 years. And, the things that the media gets about Shaun is that he's this Tony Hawk iconic person. But even in skateboarding, there's 15 other guys that would routinely and constantly beat each other every other week. And that's kind of how snowboarding was at the time. I mean, Mason Aguirre was another kid who was a few years younger than I, but wildly talented. Again, kind of one of the legends of half pipe snowboarding. Andy Finch, Tommy Shasheen, like the list goes on and on. And we every single week we're just pushing, pushing, beating, and Shaun would win a handful, and then I would win a handful. Danny Cass would win a handful. Abram Teeter would win one here and there, and um, that's how it went. And I think that it's kind of sad that the media didn't actually portray the reality of like how it all shook out. And it was just kind of the Shaun show, which is fine, and again, he was the biggest and is the biggest snowboarder probably of all time. But that's not exactly how it actually went down.
So when you look back on those times, even though you were in an individual sport, you still had this cohort that you were constantly traveling with, competing against.
Hmm.
In that way, did it feel more like a team sport, or were you still in an individual mindset?
A little bit of both. Again, the team aspect really only kind of came into play like around the Olympics because it was, a group of 4 guys that were trying to beat everybody else. But at the same time, it's still very much individual. And even in the Olympics, that's the other thing too, is all the individual sports is still very much individual, for track athletes, for swim athletes and that sort of thing. Like, of course they want to win the team events, but it's the personal one-upmanship of yourself that you're trying to reach and achieve. It's not a, and I can't speak for everybody or, generalize by any means, but most of the athletes that I know and have talked to about it is like, this is for me, like I want to do better than so and so, or I want to do the best, and I want to break that world record or whatever it is. And it's very personal always.
So was there a moment where you ever looked at your sport from like a third person perspective and said, I'm really drained by this?
Drained? Yeah, I mean, again, yeah, you kind of you grow up through it. I've been in the sport since I was 8 years old, so 20 years, and um, of course, everything you get a little burnt out, you get a little drained from it, and you figure out ways to either reinvent or, kind of push past those issues. And like I said, today I snowboard almost every week, at least both weekend days or whatever, or sometimes during the week if schedule allows. But it like I said, it's just interesting watching the trajectory of the sport from when I got involved to where it is now, and interested to kind of see where it goes over the next 10 to 20 years.
And then conversely to the mentally and emotionally drained,
Hmm.
was there a moment when you looked at yourself and said, "I am living my best life. Like, I am thriving in this moment"?
Yeah. I mean, there were a lot of those moments for sure, and it kind of goes back to um, learning responsibility as a young adult, and learning um, a lot of how the world works, and just kind of the global travel thing, the international friends and networking that we were able to do, seeing places all over the world that a lot of people are not as fortunate to be able to get to see and experience, and all that sort of stuff is, I look at the whole experience, and it was in its entirety, without a doubt, my best life. Yeah.
And I ask a lot of my guests this, but what is the one thing that sport taught you?
Well, yeah, I think it teaches us a lot of things, and I don't think you can necessarily classify it in, one little box or anything like that. But for me, I think adaptability and resourcefulness is probably the main takeaway. Like I talked about earlier, with a half pipe run going terribly wrong and not knowing what to do, and then quick decision making and your ability to kind of adapt out of the quicksand type scenario is something that I wholeheartedly believe is the number one thing that I've come away with.
And then when did you realize how finite your career would be?
Really, at the very end, for me, being, I think I was 28 at the time, 29 maybe, um, knowing full well that a half pipe competition was not going to be a long term play for me anymore. I probably wasn't going to get into the 2014 Olympics or anything like that, just because when you get into your 30s, you start to think a lot more about what you're doing and the consequences. And I had come off of a handful of injuries. I had a couple of friends have catastrophic injuries that ended careers, and a lot was happening in kind of that vein of snowboarding, where somebody like Kevin Pierce, who was a phenomenal, again, kind of an all-time great, legendary half pipe snowboarder, have a traumatic brain injury from a snowboard accident. And another friend of mine, Gretchen Bleiler, had a accident that ended her career. And it just kind of got heavy. And when, again, you're in your upper 20s rather than your lower 20s, you start to think, oh shit, that very likely could have happened to me. Like I could have a mistake, and things really could go very, very wrong, and I could end up in a wheelchair, I could end up whatever. And it was those kinds of thoughts that really started creeping in the back of the mind that never never really left. I mean, I'm still, again, snowboarding, just not on that level. I'm mountain biking a ton, I'm hiking, trail running, all sorts of mountain climbing and stuff, but it's just different when you add that element of uncertainty.
Yeah, when I was talking to the two other winter sport athletes that I have, one is on the US national team. He's a
Hmm.
skier, and then the other was a Canadian national team snowboarder.
Hmm.
And we were just talking about how when you're looking at the career trajectory of a snowboarder or a skier where your entire environment is very fast paced and some would see it as reckless.
Hmm.
How disturbing some of the injuries that you're sustaining are. I mean, you're routinely seeing your competitors and your teammates going down with season-ending injuries or career-ending injuries. I mean, the snowboarder that I brought on, she was talking about how she had a similar experience to you where she was just seeing her teammates go down
Hmm.
and then subsequently leave the sport. And
Hmm.
she was talking about this one anecdote where she was at a competition and the environment was not up to, I guess, code.
Yeah.
And she had one of her teammates go down. She was coughing up blood. She had internal bleeding. She didn't know where she was. And it
Hmm.
was at that point that she looked at her experience and she was like, I can't do this anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. And those are the scary moments because, it's not that that didn't happen when you're younger. It's just when you're younger, your brain isn't as developed, obviously, as when you're in your later 20s, to where you don't necessarily analyze or think about the after effects. When you're in your lower 20s, you just kind of assume like, well, I'm better than that, that's not going to happen to me, like I know what I'm doing, I'm blah blah blah, whatever you want to call it. And there becomes a period, I swear, I think it's like 27 or 28, you start to kind of come back down to reality and think like, oh, maybe I can't do anything and everything that I'm cooking up in my head.
So then let's fast forward. What
Mhm.
does life a decade after you're done with your sport look like?
Uh, Probably very boring to most. I after snowboarding ended for me, I've talked about this on a couple other podcasts, but it ended very abruptly and very shockingly for me. Like I said, it was coming off of just not making the third time or the second time not making Olympics, and all of my sponsor contracts were kind of lined up simultaneously. So for me, going into the 2011 season, I was a pro snowboarder, still on the contest circuit, trying to get back into the podium atmosphere and um, be a professional snowboarder. And then every single one of my sponsors by December, um, going into that year, called me and were like, well, we're done. I'm sorry, it was 2010 going into 2011. We don't feel like you're the one that we want to support anymore. We're gonna, do a different direction, what have you, what have you. And all the while I was trying to figure out like, how can I pivot from a career of half pipe contest into kind of a more, film and editorial based kind of professional snowboard career like many have done before. And, everybody just kind of quit on me. And before you know it, I was jobless, not homeless or anything, but jobless and trying to figure out how to pivot out of snowboarding and into a different career. From that, I started working for an advertising agency out of panic, like not knowing where to start, who to connect with, or anything. And ultimately being, super embarrassed about how it all ended and not really feeling overly confident to kind of reach out to a lot of snowboarding contacts that I had had. Um, Tried to go a completely different direction and try something wildly different and very new, and landed a gig with a advertising agency down in Denver, and that lasted for about 2 years. And then from that, I was contracted by a glove company in the snow sports industry to help them create a new brand, new technology, a new marketing program, and everything. I did that for 2 years, and then they pulled the plug on that. And then I got my real estate license, and that's what I'm doing now.
So was anyone helping you with with the transition out of sport, or did they just kind of say, "We're not affiliating ourselves with you. Good luck."
Yeah, it was very cold, even US snowboarding, somebody who I'd been with for a decade was just kind of like, well, thanks, you no longer on the team. And that was that. And yeah, so I didn't really get a lot of help or anybody kind of extending any sort of support whatsoever. I was really more or less out on my own and just kind of had to navigate those waters by myself.
So looking back on your entire career,
Hmm.
what are your feelings now that you've been removed for so long? I mean, do you have positive feelings or is it kind of overshadowed by the negative of how it spiraled downward?
That's a good question, actually. I would say there are still a lot of positive feelings from, time and experiences and connections and everything that I made. But yeah, there's definitely, um, a feeling of resentment a little bit towards just kind of the ending of the experience. And that, like I said before, it's something that I've been involved with and a part of for more than 20 years of my life. I've you know feel like I've really been a solid advocate and positive role model in the sport and everything. And it was really really difficult the way that it ended. And I think a lot of athletes do experience that, and I think that there's a lot of lingering kind of long-term damage in the mental sphere from a lot of the way that these things end. I talked to a lot of people that were in my generation that kind of had similar experiences as me, where the carpet was ripped right out from under them, and that was that. Um, a handful of people have pivoted and figured out, next steps of their career or seamlessly transitioned into other stuff. But then there's other people who really don't, and they get kind of stuck and hung up and really kind of reeling and trying to figure out how to move on either from snowboarding or sport or whatever, or don't, which is ultimately really sad to see.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the exit out of sport is a very interesting time because although a lot of people will say stop sport after college or stop sport after
Hmm.
high school, which are very distinct life changes,
Hmm.
when you're professionally pursuing a sport and that is your entire job
Hmm.
and there is really no backup plan and suddenly someone who you needed to rely on is
Hmm.
saying you've aged out or you're not up to par with the competition that we're bringing in.
Right.
I mean, that's a totally different conversation.
Yep. Entirely. And most I can, kind of assimilate that to would be random people getting let go of their jobs. Like, it's not a performance issue, or sometimes it is or whatever, but a lot of times it isn't, and it's just a spreadsheet, or you're not right for what we think we're doing anymore. Who knows? But yeah, it's a tough one. It's very tough to kind of um come back from. And again, like, feeling of embarrassment, resentment, and pain um, from that type of thing is challenging.
So what would you say to young athletes who are wanting to be competitive and to snowboard in the X Games and get to the level that you got to?
Yeah.
What is the first step in getting there?
Really, it's just never giving up. Like I said, it was always kind of a dream of mine and a lofty goal to have in the back burner, forefront, what have you. But really, it's just kind of keeping your eye on those goals and not quitting, and working harder and persevering through difficult times and challenging issues. And again, I look at it, and it was something that I wanted, and I didn't know if I could achieve or not. But through training and practice and um, overcoming challenges, that's how I ultimately got there. And I was never an athlete who was supposed to win the X Games, let alone twice in the sport. But there I was.
Is there anything else that you think that I missed in terms of your life story, your career trajectory, because I have concluded the questions that I plan on
Okay.
asking. And so I normally just say, is there anything that you think that I missed or you would like to talk about before we conclude?
I'm trying to think. I don't think you missed anything. That was a broad spectrum of things that we covered. So that was awesome. Good question.
Thank you.
Um, no, I mean, I guess, is there anything else that you kind of wanted to specifically hit on as it relates to like sports and mental health or anything like
No,
that?
I mean,
Or
I think that when I talk to extreme sport athletes, so
hmm
much of it is visualization and the flow state,
hmm
being exactly where you need to be, or else you could get seriously injured.
hmm
And I think that we talked a considerable amount on that.
Okay, cool. Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And that's again, like I said previously, for me, it was kind of the like just thinking enough and not thinking too much and letting your body kind of take over and do what it does. For me was like that was the sweet spot.
And I think that this will go out next week or two
Sweet.
weeks from now. So
Awesome.
can you just send me a picture that you would like me to use on social media?
Sure. Yeah, I'll have to dive into my computer, but I will certainly email you something.
Awesome. And
Yeah,
then I'll put it out on social when it's published, and if you could just like retweet it or put it on your Instagram story, that would be
of
great.
course. Yeah. Happy to help.
Thanks so much for chatting with me.
Yeah, thank you
Taking
very
the
much.
time to dig back in the archives.
Yeah,
That's cool. What is the jersey behind you?
that was the 2002 Olympics where I foreran.
That's cool.
Yeah,
So I
yeah.
guess what do you think of when you see that?
Well, knowing what I know now, and it's not a popular opinion, but it's an opinion that most athletes have now, is that the Olympics is nothing but a TV show anymore. I mean, it is, of course, a pinnacle atmosphere for athletes to go and perform at their best level. But ultimately speaking, it's a media event at this point, and um, it's NBC's done a really good job of marketing, it the way that it is, and people really buy into the whole thing. But it's crazy. I don't know.
That's Yeah, I mean, when I think of the Olympics, I get really excited because it is like the pinnacle of sports, but
hmm
it's just another day. It's just another race. It's just
hmm
another competition, and that's kind of how you have to view it.
Totally. And the hard part again that people don't talk about, especially because not as many are on my side of it, but you know the Olympics is a place to showcase who's doing the best at the moment. It doesn't, and the fact that snowboarding specifically, like in the US, we really should have like 8 to 10 spots, but we're only allotted 4 because of the IOC rules and all that sort of stuff. And, just like the sport governing body, what have you, of people who, aren't even, they were never really Olympians themselves. Like there may be one or two, but it's just random people dictating like what you as an athlete get to accomplish at what time. And I don't know, it's difficult in that way, but you know again, I don't think it always showcases the best athletes in the world. I think any other random World Cup or X Games, for instance, Grand Prix typically have a lot more talent at them than ultimately the Olympics has. And yeah, the top 5 or top 6 in the Olympics is that's it for sure. Like they're the top 5 or top 6 or whatever. But um, in 2002, the whole field, literally the whole field, any single one of those people could have won that event, and I just think it's come a far ways away from that.
So when you look at, I guess, is that why you were talking earlier about the media coverage and how unfair it is to only
hmm
cover half the year of competition because not only are you missing all of those events,
Hmm.
period, but you're also missing all of those amazing competitors.
Totally. Yeah. 2002, I mean, was completely nuts. That was like, so Ross Powers, Danny Cass, JJ Thomas all were the US podium sweep, first US podium sweep in I don't know however many years, and they did it. But then the international field at that time was completely insane too. Just to rattle off names for you, like Jan Michaelis from Germany, Iker Fernandez from Spain, Trevor Andrew from Canada. I mean, like Magnus Sterner from Sweden, Thomas Johansson from Sweden. There were so many international guys at that event that got nothing. Heikki Sorsa from Finland. He was another one who, my God, like one of the all time best snowboarders on the planet ever. And have you ever heard of him? Like there's so many ridiculously talented people who a lot of the world just never gets access to.
So how do we go about changing that?
Well, I honestly, I don't know. I think unfortunately that's, you have to ask somebody like NBC as to why they don't cover it and why they're not invested in the sport. I mean, Surf League is another one that has come a long way, but they're still kind of hit or miss. It's not a widely followed sport either. Probably more than snowboarding, but not nearly what I think the level of difficulty and the amazing athletes that are in surfing too is just insane. But yeah, I don't know. I think it's tough. It's always tough when you have free events and people aren't like lining up to buy tickets. I think um, winter sports, obviously, people standing outside in the cold is difficult. Like it's all stacked against it.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of work to be done in representation for
Mm-hmm.
sports like snowboarding because you do only have a couple of people
Mm-hmm.
who are portrayed as the best.
Mm-hmm.
Meanwhile, there are like 15 people who are equally as good and are just kind of moving around up and down and they're exchanging the podium spots, but they're
Uh-huh.
not the ones that really get covered because they're winning different events.
Mm-hmm. Yep, 100%. And yeah, it's just I don't know. Again, I think another very large problem with action sports or individual, even Olympic sports, is the fact that there's no players' union at all. So everybody's getting taken advantage of on a daily basis. I don't know if you've seen, but the movie The Weight of Gold by Brett Rapkin. It was on HBO and um, largely kind of followed like Michael Phelps, Lolo Jones, and a couple other Olympic athletes on this kind of very subject. And I would encourage everybody to watch and research that film because it is, I mean, really breathtaking with how vulnerable those. Sasha Cohen is the other one, the figure skater, um, because a lot of the, again, like figure skating, again, just the lack of a union or a athlete centric organization that's looking out for the athletes is severely hindering its ability to make that jump.
Wow. And I think we can end on that one.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
Thank you so much for chatting with me. And
Totally.
I love seeing the buildings that you have in the works on
Oh,
Instagram. I think they're just beautiful.
oh, thank you. Yeah.
You work in Breckenridge?
Yeah. So I live and work in Breckenridge. My service area for real estate is all of Summit County. I do a handful of stuff just outside of Summit County, but not very much. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the builds that you have are just gorgeous.
Ah, thank you. Yeah, that's a house that we're completing that closes next week. So
Wow.
down to the finish line. Yeah.
All right. And I'll talk to you later.
Yeah.
If you can just, like I was saying, message me or email me a picture I can use for the little social media on Instagram, that would be great. And
Totally.
I'll talk to you, I think next week it'll go out.
Okay, awesome. Thanks so much.
Have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, you too.
Bye.